The fat rights and fat liberation movement is said to have many origins. One that it started with fat black women, one that ties the movement to Stonewall and gay rights, but today we're going to go deep into the real story of how the fat liberation movement began, from its founders, its mission, and most importantly, the dangerous and unhealthy practices that it encouraged for decades. The fat acceptance movement started in 1967 when Steve Post, a 23-year-old man, held a fat-in Central Park. The event was meant to bring awareness to fat discrimination, and the participants were told to show up with food. Pictures of Twiggy, the iconic thin model of the time, were burned, along with diet books. A total of 500 people, fat and thin, showed up to the event that day. When the attendees were asked why they attended the event, one athletic 17-year-old boy ate lasagna and said, "I'm not fat, but I'm trying to be." Another 26-year-old man said that obesity was good for peace, and if everyone is fat, there would be no war. No one could pass the physical. The fat-in inspired another influential fat activism leader, Lou Louderbeck, who wrote in that same year an article for the Saturday Evening Post titled, "More People Should Be Fat." The content of the article was true to its name and outlined all the reasons they believed being fat was good. Some of these reasons included a higher rate of sexual responsiveness in fat women, fat people having lower risks of tuberculosis, fat people being more relaxed because they don't have to diet, and most notably that being thin is so in that fat people's civil rights are being repeatedly and openly violated. One of the people that saw and resonated with the "More People Should Be Fat" article was a man named Bill Fabry. He didn't like how his fat wife was treated for being fat, and he was also a self-identified fat admirer. So Bill reached out to Lou, and together in 1969, they created the National Association for Fat Acceptance. The goal of the organization, according to Fabry, was to advance social acceptance for fat people as well as fat admirers, aka the people who have a strong sexual attraction to fat people. Now, when it comes to fat admiration, there are a lot of different subcultures, but one of the more common and by far the most controversial is the encouraging/gaining dynamic. There is a much more common term for this dynamic, but it's so taboo that even Tumblr censors the usage of the word, and I didn't think Tumblr censored anything. So because of YouTube guidelines, I'll refrain from using that word, and for the sake of this video, we'll call it encouraging. But encouraging is when a person continuously tries to get their partner to gain weight. The person who gains the weight is the gainer, and the person who encourages them is the encourager. It's not surprising why this type of sexual play is controversial, as the continuous weight gain causes one person in the relationship to become extremely unhealthy. Often, encouragers have fantasies of their gainer becoming so large that they are immobile, or other similar fantasies that drastically decrease the gainer's quality of life. A common instance when you'll see speculation on whether someone is an encourager is the partners of extremely overweight people on shows like My 600-Pound Life, because it's not uncommon for these partners to be openly against their 600-pound partner losing weight. And while those people very well might be encouragers, that isn't always the case. Sometimes people choose to marry or date very large people because they like the security that comes from having a partner that's dependent on them. If your partner is so large that they are reliant on you for everything, from grocery shopping to bathing, it's difficult for that person to physically or metaphorically walk out of your life. So for those people, their overweight partner losing weight is a threat to the security they feel in their relationship. And another reason someone might discourage their overweight partner from losing weight is that that person might just be a run-of-the-mill fat admirer that worries that they will no longer be attracted to their partner if they lose a significant amount of weight. But no matter what the reason, be it you like having your partner being dependent on you, or you're an encourager, or you just think you won't be attracted to your partner if they lose weight, discouraging your partner from getting healthy is wrong, no matter what the reason is. Also, encouraging your partner to be unhealthy is also wrong. And when it comes to the encourager-gainer dynamic, there often are gainers that like gaining the weight, but even so, encouraging is not a good practice. And I can already hear someone in the comments saying, "You're kink shaming." Yes, I am. Slowly killing someone with food is unethical, even if the person you're slowly killing is aware that you're doing it. But anyway, Bill Fabry was a self-identified fat admirer, but from what I can tell, not an encourager. But he created NAAFA with a mission to not only advance social acceptance for fat people, but also advance social acceptance for fat admirers like himself. This decision was not taken well by some members of the organization, including Lou Louderbeck. So despite being a co-founder of NAAFA, who was part of the catalyst that started the whole organization, Lou stepped down from the board of directors less than a year after NAAFA's inception. And it was within this first year that Bill and the board of directors created something called NAAFA Date, which was a dating service where members could join and try to get matched with other members. Creating NAAFA Date was a strategic move to not only find dates for NAAFA members, but to also increase NAAFA membership. From the beginning, NAAFA struggled to get people into the organization. Bill even said in a 2001 interview, "We found that the need for social interaction with others who don't disapprove of your body was so powerful that we could not attract members without offering it. So NAAFA Date was born, and we started holding dances and mixers in several cities." So, said in another way, the cause to advance civil rights for fat people wasn't enough to draw members to NAAFA. The organization needed to give people something they really wanted, and that was romantic and sexual interactions. Dating was the incentive the organization needed to stay afloat because it appealed to both fat women and fat admirers. NAAFA Date continued to be a staple in the organization's newsletter throughout the 1970s, and membership slowly and steadily grew to about 1,500 members nationwide by 1980. The demographics of the organization was almost exclusively white. There are references to the lack of racial diversity in NAAFA from early newsletters, with one member saying, "I wonder if NAAFA may itself have too narrow an ethnic basis. We appear, for example, to have little or no Black or Latin membership." The organization was also about 70% women, and most of the men in the organization seemed to be fat admirers. One writing from an early newsletter says, "The NAAFA office continuously gets mail from men throughout the country who are definite fat admirers. From reading these letters and also talking to my personal acquaintance, I might be able to say a few words about the men who admire large ladies. The following remarks therefore exclude those men who join NAAFA only because of their own weight problem or on behalf of the civil rights of others." So This is saying that a lot of men joined NAAFA exclusively because of their attraction to fat women, with no stake in the civil rights issues of fat people. NAAFA membership also seemed to be almost exclusively straight, considering there are a lot of writings that don't look favorably at lesbians in the newsletters. And last but not least, most of the women were also morbidly obese, as defined in a NAAFA newsletter as people who hold over 50% of their body weight in fat. During the 70s, NAAFA also started adding personal dating ads in their newsletter of what was usually a fat woman looking for a partner or a fat admirer looking for a fat woman. NAAFA also held annual conventions where members show up to party, attend events, and socialize. These events were, according to members and non-members alike, a giant meat fest, full of lots of lustful behavior. One NAAFA newsletter article addresses this by saying, "It has been pointed out that NAAFA tries to promote dignity and self-respect for fat people, yet much of the social environment provided at the conventions seems to be a, quote, meat market, with much competitiveness between those searching for sexual partners and the occasional, quote, wild party becoming legendary in its own time." The question is inevitably raised. How does this help the dignity and self-esteem of fat people? And does such a sexual atmosphere belong at our conventions? The answers are almost obvious. Sex at conventions? So what else is new? Isn't NAAFA saying that fat people and their admirers are no better and no worse than the rest of humanity? Personally, I regret the meat rack element of the singles social climate, but it was not created by NAAFA or by conventions per se. It was created by human nature. Another 1982 newsletter says, "Unfortunately, though, too many NAAFA folks seem to see this organization as a singles club for fat women and male fat admirers, with an underlying assumption running around in there somewhere that both are somehow desperate, can't find companionship in the real world, and must resort to monthly meeting and a couple of conventions a year to get any sort of satisfying love life going." This was driven home to me with a piledriver force at the recent NAAFA convention in Columbus, Ohio. I can't even remember how many people came up to me and said, "Oh, how nice you're here because you're attracted to fat women." Another 1986 article says, "There have always been, including many non-members, who regard NAAFA as one of the more stable, principled, serious-minded, reasonable, sane human rights organizations in existence. And then those, including many members, who think of NAAFA as a meat market for singles." We also know that NAAFA is a social cauldron for many, with an element of prom night that some members never experienced when they were in high school. So NAAFA social events that were mostly between fat female members and male fat admirers gained quite a reputation in and out of the organization. The 1980s seemed to be the time when NAAFA really started leaning into advocating for fat admirers and also encouragers. In one 1983 letter published by the newsletter, one NAAFA member is outraged that a famous columnist, Ann Landers, called the men trying to get one woman to 700 pounds sickies. The article writer said that fat admirers need to defend their right to admire fat people without condemnation, and felt personally slighted at the idea of any reference to encouraging being bad, unhealthy, or unethical. NAAFA also had a bunch of committees in the organization called special interest groups. These committees were meant to advocate for whatever group they represented, and they included topics like singles, couples, fat men, feminists, and leadership. And starting in 1983, they added 3 new special interest groups, including the Fat Admirer Special Interest Group, headed by a man and NAAFA member named Conrad Blinkensdorfer. Conrad himself was a fat admirer, but Conrad, unlike Bill Fabry, wasn't just a run-of-the-mill fat admirer. Conrad was said to be an encourager. In fact, some online forums still refer to him as the father of encouraging for reasons you will see later. Conrad even found his wife, Ruby, through an ad she posted in one of these fat admirer sites in 1981. And after founding the Fat Admirer Special Interest Group in 1983, Conrad and Ruby created the FA-SIG, Fat Admirer Special Interest Group, magazine. These were physical magazines that people inside and outside NAAFA could subscribe to for an annual fee, or buy each copy individually. And just 4 years after starting the Fat Admirer Special Interest Group, Conrad was elected as NAAFA's chairman of the board, the highest position within the organization. But the FA-SIG magazine was created to, unsurprisingly, pander to male fat admirers. There's even small references to encourager behavior in one of the magazine covers where a very large woman is sitting in a chair with a skinny dude in the background cooking food. But from 1983 to 1988, the magazine was called FA-SIG. But starting in September 1988, the name was changed to Dimensions. The Dimensions magazine slowly evolved between 1983 into the 1990s. It went from drawings on the covers to actual color photos of models. And membership for the Dimensions magazine skyrocketed, especially after an online chat forum was added for fat admirers to discuss and look at photos of fat women. The magazine itself looked like any other magazine from the era, full of centerfolds, scantily clad models, and lots of ads. There are a few notable things about the Dimensions magazine in the 1990s and early 2000s. First, the online forum was full, and I mean full, of encouragers, especially the Dimensions weight room, which was apparently a section of the Dimensions site full of forums relating to encouraging behavior. This includes weight gain stories, the weight board, weight chat, a guide to fattening, and the 500 Club, which was photos and discussions of women who had reached over 500 pounds. Needless to say, this site was an encourager's paradise, and at the time, the Dimensions weight room was the largest collection of fat admirer and encourager content on the internet. The second thing to note about the Dimensions magazine was that many of the models that were on the cover and within centerfolds of the magazines were NAAFA members, as in women who had joined NAAFA, weren't models, but ended up being on the cover of a Fat Admiration magazine. And there's no more interesting example of this than Zsalynn Whitworth. Zsalynn had reached 375 pounds by the time she was in high school, and in 1992, when she was about 23 years old, she joined NAAFA.
Longest time I felt totally fine about my weight. I was actually kind of proud of it. I guess at about 19 years old, I found the organization NAAFA, the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. And that's when I decided, whatever size I am, I'm just going to be this size. Who cares?
In April of 1997, she appeared on the cover of the Dimensions magazine with a woman named Cindy. And around that time in the late 90s, Dimensions started a production company called Dimensions Wide Angle Productions, where they sold and produced sexy videos. These videos weren't X-rated, but pretty darn close. And they included a whole bunch of sexy stuff, including videos of very large women eating. There were a lot of different models featured in these videos, and most of them had also been on the cover of the Dimensions magazine at one time or another, and Zsalynn was no exception. She was featured in multiple Dimensions videos in the late 90s, and was also active in other internet chat rooms where she met men who adored her, at that point, over 400-pound body. She was flown throughout the world to meet fat admirers, which is how she ended up meeting her British husband in 2001. Zsalynn continued life through the 2000s and had a daughter with her husband in 2004. But in the early 2010s, she had grown to almost 600 pounds and no longer liked the size that she was at. This led her to trying to seek out bariatric surgery, but she couldn't afford it. So to try to raise money, she once again started selling sexy photos online. Despite never being fully nude in the photos, Zsalynn said she hated having to objectify herself like that to make money. In a 2014 interview, she said, "It got to the point where I didn't look in the mirror at myself. So why would anyone want to look at a picture of me? Anyone who can find me attractive, anyone who can look at that picture and not see how miserable I am, has to be blinded by something." But Zsalynn soon found that there was a new show that would pay for her bariatric surgery if she was chosen and agreed to be on it. So Zsalynn applied to be on the TLC reality show My 600 Pound Life. Her episode was released as the first one of season 2, and Zsalynn's surgery and weight loss ended up being very successful. She lost almost 200 pounds during the course of the show, and as of 2022, has lost over 370 pounds. Zsalynn also divorced her very unsupportive husband after the show, Gareth, a man who was a self-identified fat admirer, who was unhappy with Zsalynn losing weight because he was attracted to and married a big girl. And he had expected Zsalynn to stay big, despite her saying that the main reason she wanted to lose weight was to stay alive for their daughter.
He says, "I married you 10 years ago when you were a happy fat girl, and I was happy to marry a happy fat girl. If you'd have told me 10 years ago I was marrying an unhappy fat girl, then maybe I wouldn't have married you." It's really hard to talk about Gareth because, he wants a fat wife. He wants what he's physically attracted to. I realized I've been telling myself a lie, and that lie was killing me. Big can't be beautiful when it means my daughter may not have a mother.
Thank God he's out of the picture. Zsalynn's story had a happy ending with a seemingly much improved life since her weight loss surgery. But from what I found, she's really the only one of the Dimensions models from that period in the late 90s who ended up having a good quality of life after being in the Dimensions magazine. In fact, Cindy, the woman that was featured with Zsalynn on the 1997 Dimensions cover, ended up passing in 2009 after also being featured in many Dimensions videos, including ones that bragged about the fact that Cindy was almost 500 pounds. Cindy was either in her 30s or 40s when she died. There are many other models that were heavily featured on the Dimensions chat room that ended up living pretty short lives. Like Betsy, a woman who made a lot of content that pandered to encouragers of herself eating and is labeled by some the internet's first gainer. She died at the age of 57 after a lifetime of making gainer content. And then there's Kelly, another famous woman in the Dimensions weight room that only lived till the age of 47. And Deirdre, another woman that was heavily featured in Dimensions and made her career out of being a fat model, died in her early 50s. And on top of that, there are a lot more horrifying stories of Dimensions models and their lives after being featured in the site. Most notably, it's the models who ended up dating or marrying encouragers. One woman, Gina Gershwin-Varney, has a long history with NAAFA. Gina said that through her mid-20s, she never received any romantic attention from men. So in the mid-80s, she put out an ad for men who wanted to date her. She made it clear that she was about 400 pounds, and she got a lot of responses. One of the responses she got was from a man named Mark, who she ended up marrying a year or two later. Both Gina and Mark became NAAFA members shortly after that, and were heavily featured in the November 1989 NAAFA newsletter. The couple talked about wanting to adopt a child, but were struggling because most adoption agencies wouldn't consider them to be adoptive parents because of Gina's size. Sometime later in the late 90s or early 2000s, Gina and Mark did end up adopting a daughter. But the couple continued their NAAFA membership into the 90s, and during that time, Gina grew. A lot. Like hundreds of pounds. And her husband, Mark, who enjoyed seeing Gina gain weight, documented her growth with detailed scrapbooks. He even took these photos and sold them to other fat admirers so he could show off how large his wife had gotten. And eventually, he started making and selling videos of Gina as well. And apparently, these videos are very popular in the fat admiration community, to the point where I've come across multiple people on fat admiration forums asking where they can buy Gina's videos as late as 2022. But Gina was featured in the Dimension's infamous 500 Club. She was one of, if not the largest woman in the world in the early 2000s. Her story, along with her husband, is documented in a 2003 documentary. I don't recommend watching it because it's one of the most disturbing things I've ever seen, and there's a reason it's age restricted. But to summarize, Mark treated Gina like a pet that he could grow as large as he wanted, all the way up till she was 821 pounds. And when Gina finally decided she wanted to lose weight because she wanted to stay alive with her daughter that they had struggled so hard to adopt, they actually had to go to marriage counseling because Mark was so upset about it. Gina said that Mark struggled to even look at her for a while after making the decision to get weight loss surgery. Gina and Mark's involvement in NAAFA lessened after the documentary because it was not well received by NAAFA members. But Gina lived until 2015 and apparently spent the last 5 years of her life in a lot of pain. But aside from Gina, there's also the story of Deborah Perkins, another famous member of the 500 Club. I'm going to give you the quick version of her story because it's really sad, but according to the Guinness Book of World Records, Deborah was considered the biggest model in the world in the early 90s at over 700 pounds. She was featured in almost every fat admiration magazine in the world at that time and had countless fat admirers lusting after her. One of these men, who was apparently a prominent figure in the fat activism movement, ended up dating Deborah. He got her into his old house, where she couldn't leave due to her size and the structure of the home. He fed her relentlessly with junk food for 2 years until she really couldn't move anymore, and in a last-ditch effort to save her own life, Deborah called her mom, who then called the cops, who had to show up with 25 specialists, including firefighters and an ambulance, to literally cut Deborah out of the home because she couldn't walk and they had to remove her from the house on the mattress that she was laying on. Deborah ended up in the hospital, but her captor still sent her gifts with candy in it, with notes saying that he hopes she's still eating and hasn't fallen into diet culture. Deborah survived that incident, but ended up dying in 2011 at the age of 54. So the track record for women who were associated with the Dimensions magazine was not good. But Conrad ran Dimensions as the chairman of NAAFA all the way through the 90s. And as I was learning all of this information about the magazine, it dawned on me just how much money NAAFA was making. There are multiple references to a lack of money to run NAAFA throughout their newsletters in the 70s and 80s. Throughout that time, most of the money NAAFA made to fund the organization came from the annual membership dues each member paid, along with some small donations. In the late 80s, the membership fee was $35 per year for the lowest and most common tier. NAAFA membership peaked around 3,000 members sometime in the 90s, So they were making somewhere between $100,000 to $150,000 per year from its membership dues and some donations. But the Dimensions magazine had way more subscribers, about 15,000 of them at one point at least. And the annual subscription to Dimensions cost $18. So the magazine was making at least $270,000. And that's only counting subscriptions. That doesn't include individual magazines that were sold for $5 to $6 each, the other services offered in the magazine, like a pay-per-minute chat line, and the Dimensions video production company, where they were selling videos of people like Cindy and Zsalynn. So NAAFA was making at least twice as much money off of the Dimensions magazine than it was from its own membership fees. And making money off of nearly X-rated content isn't awful on its own, but NAAFA was a civil rights organization. So for them to not only own a nearly X-rated site, but to profit off of selling sexualized images of their own members is, at the very least, unprofessional, and at worst, highly unethical, especially considering the lack of male attention that most Dimensions models likely dealt with their whole lives. Many recountings of NAAFA social events describe them as a sort of prom night, where very fat women get the romantic attention they desperately wanted in their youth. And NAAFA and Dimensions seemed to take advantage of that. A lot of these women felt completely rejected in the areas of sexuality and romance. So when they were told by NAAFA that not only is it completely fine to be 400 pounds, but if they come into the organization, they'll find a lot of men that like women their size. Of course, these women are going to be excited about it. And doubly so after they're told, hey, you can get even more attention and validation from men if you show your body in the Dimensions magazine. If you do that, you'll have thousands of men all over the world begging to be with you. And that had the effect of opening up these women to be preyed upon by fat admirers who may not have had the best intentions for them. But it also made Dimensions a lot of money. So while I'm sure the women in the Dimensions site agreed to be on it, and some may have even been compensated for it, I also believe NAAFA took advantage of these women's desires to be attractive and to be lusted after in order to make Dimensions successful and profitable. But the Dimensions magazine and its online chat room continued to be successful into the early 2000s before Dimensions moved entirely online, and the online site was mostly shut down for reasons that I'm not sure of. In 2003, a new Dimensions site was launched that, from what I can tell, was like an early version of OnlyFans. It had a bunch of different fat women that charged a monthly fee for their subscribers to see photos of them. Most of the photos on the site are now gone, but you can still see the setup of what each woman charged for their services. This new Dimensions site existed from 2003 until 2005, when the site eventually rolled into a different company where it has existed ever since. But this new 2003 version of Dimensions was again made under the direction of Conrad. But at the end of 2003, he stepped down from the NAAFA board of directors after being the chairman for 16 years. And only a few months later, in April of 2004, NAAFA made its first official statement against the practice of encouraging, while also maintaining their official policy of being pro-fat admiration. The organization seemed to keep this stance until at least 2008, when they changed their site to remove all their official policies on the subject. But recently, at the beginning of 2022, NAAFA made an official apology for promoting an event about allyship for fat admirers and chubby chasers because they are now considered problematic and dangerous terms. So now, NAAFA has a staunchly anti-fat admirer stance, a far cry from the original NAAFA creators' mission, but probably better nonetheless. Overall, NAAFA has a strange history, one that heavily conflicts with the modern narrative about what fat acceptance and body positivity is. The fat liberation movement has often been said to have been started by fat, black, queer women to advance their own liberation.
The whole way that body positivity, which started as a movement by black fat people, has been co-opted by white, thin women.
Fat acceptance, though, was always rooted in centering fat, black, queer women, many of whom were disabled.
Let's talk about the body positive movement. The body positive movement originated in the 1960s when the fat acceptance movement was taking place, and it was created for marginalized bodies, plus-size people, people of color, specifically women of color.
But by all accounts, it's the exact opposite. It was started by skinny, white, straight men to make their sexual attraction to fat women more socially acceptable. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's the truth of the matter. The first 33 years of NAAFA was headed by two white men who were both openly fat admirers. Not only that, but NAAFA as a whole was pretty homogenous in its composition, with very few non-white women and few lesbians. But despite NAAFA now officially condemning fat admiration, the legacy of NAAFA's fat admiration roots still exist to this day. The Dimensions magazine site is still up and running, even though it's no longer affiliated with NAAFA, and it's still full of all of the fat admiration content anyone's heart could desire. Aside from that, NAAFA has always held the stance that obesity is not unhealthy, or at the very least, obesity is not as unhealthy as doctors believe it is. But the short lifespans of NAAFA members from their early days, especially the self-identified supersized members, are a direct contradiction of that belief. Not only did countless Dimensions models live short lives, but many other very overweight NAAFA members only lived until their 50s. Some of the most notable ones being Sherry Collins Eckert, a woman I referenced in a previous video about NAAFA conventions, who was a size 60 in the mid-90s. She lived till the age of 53. Then there's Paula Dacus, a longtime NAAFA vice president with a self-identified fat admirer husband who lived till the age of 55. It's clear that a lot of the supersized women associated with fat positivity in the 80s and 90s did not live long lives and were not healthy. And even if NAAFA now condemns encouraging and fat admiration, their belief that obesity isn't unhealthy is something that will always benefit fat admirers. Because if there's no such thing as an unhealthy weight, then what's the problem with encouraging if both parties agree to it? It's not like feeding a gainer till they're 800 pounds makes that person unhealthy, right? So what's the harm in it? And when I was beginning my research for this video, I asked some of my followers for any information they have on the encouraging community, and I got an interesting response from a female encourager. She said that she used to be heavily involved in the encourager-gainer community before realizing that the practice was unhealthy and unethical, and that the idea that someone can be healthy at every size was untrue. She said, encouragers are also highly encouraged to do research on fat liberation so they can understand the struggles of their gainers and help support them through their weight gain. This is commonly thought to be the ethical thing to do, even though in reality, there is no ethical way to approach this. I feel like this also makes it easier for encouragers to continue enabling gainers, because it makes them feel like there is little to no health risks associated with what they're doing, so they're doing nothing wrong. I know for me, I wanted to believe in health at every size so badly that I didn't think critically about it and ignored all the logical fallacies. I'm guessing that's the case with a lot of encouragers. Some people are so deep in it that it would be a complete lifestyle change to leave, especially for the gainers who have literally destroyed their health for this. So it's probably easier for them to believe that what they're doing is safe and fine than to accept the truth. Fat acceptance advocates, like the people in NAAFA, and encouragers alike, believe that obesity has no health risks involved because it's a belief that fits well with their current lifestyles. They believe it because they really want to believe it. If you are extremely overweight, it's a seductive thought to think that your size is perfectly healthy, that you can continue to chug along in life, possibly gaining even more weight, and there will be no negative consequences to that choice in the future. And that same belief is just as seductive to encouragers. They enjoy making people gain massive amounts of weight, often to the point where the gainer is unhealthy. But if obesity isn't unhealthy, well, they can continue going on with their lifestyle with a clear conscience. And that's why the core fat liberation belief that obesity isn't unhealthy will always benefit the fat admiration community while putting fat women at risk. It not only puts fat liberationists in a state of denial about the risks of their obesity, but the belief also makes it easier for them to fall victim to encouragers. Because if they already see nothing wrong with gaining massive amounts of weight, then they won't see getting involved with someone who wants them to gain a lot of weight as the massive red flag it is. Not to mention that encouragers may also take advantage of and exacerbate the binge eating or food addiction problems that many very large fat liberationists they come across may have. And because the belief that obesity isn't unhealthy is such a seductive idea to both encourager and fat acceptance advocates, there is a huge amount of overlap between the encourager community and the fat acceptance community. In fact, if you go to fatliberation.org, what do you find? Well, it's a site dedicated to encouragers and fat liberation, with a whole bunch of articles about fat liberation and why being fat is perfectly fine and why gaining a whole bunch of weight is not unhealthy. It's basically repackaged fat acceptance talking points with a little bit more thrown in about encouraging and gaining. And the people that run fatliberation.org also have their own social media and even podcasts where they talk about the relationship between fat liberation and the encourager community. And aside from that, it only takes a quick search on any social media site like Twitter, Instagram, or Tumblr to find an endless amount of content of people defending the encourager lifestyle by citing fat acceptance ideas. And oddly enough, the people or organizations that are cited to defend encouraging are often against the practice. The fatliberation.org site even has links to NAAFA resources and other fat activists that I know are against encouraging. And yet, those people and organizations are cited anyway, which just goes to show how intertwined fat liberation and the encourager community are. And when it comes to defending encouraging and gaining, some go as far as to say that the social acceptance of encouraging will only grow if more fat liberation ideas take off in the mainstream, which, first of all, sounds very similar to the idea Bill Fabry had when creating NAAFA to begin with. And two, that's probably true, but isn't that terrifying to think about? More social acceptance for encouraging if more people start believing in fat acceptance? I said earlier in the video that I think slowly killing someone with food is unethical, even if the person you're slowly killing is aware that you're doing it. And even if you don't believe that's true, that two people can engage in this dynamic with full consent and that it isn't unethical, you still have to agree that the gainer has to be fully aware of the risks of gaining, including the risks of obesity, to be able to fully consent to being a gainer. So if a gainer was fed false information about the risks of obesity, either by an encourager or by the modern fat acceptance movement, I would argue that they can't fully consent to being part of any encourager-gainer dynamic because they don't understand the risks, which is part of what makes the fat acceptance idea that obesity isn't unhealthy and that people can be healthy at every size so dangerous. All in all, fat liberation and fat admiration of all forms are inextricably linked, and they always will be. NAAFA's existence proved that, and so does the clear benefit that both fat admirers and fat liberationists get from the false belief that obesity and excessive weight gain is not unhealthy. And as much as the fat acceptance movement would like to celebrate fatness and believe in fat positivity, the stories of the women who have spent their 20s and 30s celebrating and reveling in their fatness did not live long lives. And their outcomes were even more grim when they were surrounded by fat admirers. But yeah, that's the end of the video. This one has been a long time coming, but I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in the next one.